In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through every valley and courage is measured not in medals but in heartbeats, one soldier would redefine what it means to push beyond human limits. This is the story of a warrior who, despite having 9 bullet holes torn through her body, carried a fallen comrade 6 grueling miles through enemy territory, a feat so extraordinary that it challenges everything we think we know about the human spirit and the bonds forged in combat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 2012, and the war in Afghanistan was entering its most brutal phase. Taliban insurgents had grown bolder, their tactics more sophisticated, their knowledge of the terrain unmatched. For the coalition forces operating in the remote regions of Helmand Province, every mission carried the weight of uncertainty. Would they all make it home? The landscape itself seemed designed for ambush. Narrow passes carved between towering peaks, rocky outcroppings that provided perfect cover for snipers, and ancient trails that had witnessed countless battles throughout history. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had already completed 2 tours of duty when she volunteered for her 3rd deployment. At 28 years old, she was a decorated combat medic whose reputation preceded her. Fellow soldiers spoke of her with a mixture of admiration and relief. When Rodriguez was on a mission, everyone knew they had someone who would never leave them behind. Her medical training was exemplary, but it was her unwavering determination and fierce loyalty that set her apart from her peers. The mission briefing on that fateful October morning seemed routine enough, a reconnaissance patrol through the Sangin Valley to gather intelligence on Taliban movements. What intelligence hadn't prepared them for was the sophisticated network of fighters who had been watching their every move for weeks, studying their patterns, learning their tactics, and preparing an ambush that would test every ounce of training and courage these soldiers possessed. Rodriguez's squad consisted of 8 highly trained soldiers, each a specialist in their field. There was Corporal James Mitchell, a communications expert from Texas, whose quick wit had gotten them out of tight spots before. Private First Class Sarah Chen, a sharpshooter whose accuracy was legendary among the battalion. Sergeant Mike Torres, an explosives expert who could disarm an IED blindfolded. These weren't just soldiers. They were a family forged by shared hardship and mutual trust. As they moved through the valley in the pre-dawn darkness, their night vision goggles casting the world in eerie green shadows, Rodriguez felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the unit's medic. Her pack contained not just standard medical supplies, but experimental treatments that could mean the difference between life and death in the field. She had studied every possible battlefield injury scenario, practiced emergency procedures until they became muscle memory, and mentally prepared herself for the worst-case situations. What she couldn't have prepared for was becoming the patient herself while simultaneously needing to save others. The terrain they traversed was treacherous even without enemy contact. Loose shale shifted under their boots, threatening to send rocks cascading down the mountainside and alert any listening ears to their presence. Ancient goat paths wound precariously along cliff faces where a single misstep could prove fatal. The air was thin at this altitude, making every breath precious and every movement deliberate. They had trained for this environment, but training could never fully replicate the combination of exhaustion, adrenaline, and constant vigilance required for survival in these mountains. Rodriguez's training as a medic had taught her to read the signs of stress and fatigue in her fellow soldiers. She noticed the slight tremor in Mitchell's hands as he checked his radio equipment, a sign that the communications specialist was pushing through more exhaustion than he was letting on. She observed the way Chen's breathing had become slightly labored, indicating that even their best sharpshooter was feeling the effects of the altitude and the weight of their equipment. These weren't weaknesses, they were human responses to inhuman conditions. The squad moved with practiced precision through the valley, each soldier maintaining perfect spacing and communication discipline. Their movements were synchronized after months of working together, a deadly ballet performed in hostile territory. Rodriguez took pride in being part of this unit, knowing that each person would sacrifice everything for the others. This bond, stronger than family ties, would soon be tested in ways none of them could imagine. As the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern peaks in shades of gold and pink, the squad paused to assess their position. They were approximately 3 miles into their planned route, with another 5 miles to cover before reaching their extraction point. The valley ahead narrowed significantly, creating what military strategists call a fatal funnel, a geographic feature that limits movement options and creates optimal conditions for an ambush. Rodriguez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The attack came without warning, as the best ambushes always do. One moment, the squad was moving through what appeared to be an empty valley. The next, the world exploded in a symphony of automatic weapons fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and the distinctive crack of sniper rifles echoing off the canyon walls. The Taliban had chosen their killing field with precision, a narrow section of the valley where the Americans would have limited cover and no easy escape routes. Rodriguez's combat instincts kicked in immediately. Even as bullets whined past her head, she was already scanning for wounded soldiers and identifying the best defensive positions. The initial barrage had caught them in the open, but years of training under fire had prepared them for exactly this scenario. The squad scattered with practiced efficiency, each soldier seeking whatever cover the rocky terrain could provide. "Contact front, contact left, we've got shooters on the ridgeline!" Mitchell's voice crackled through their communication system, his Texas drawl somehow managing to remain calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions. They were facing a coordinated attack from a force significantly larger than their 8-person squad. The Taliban fighters had done their homework. They knew exactly where to position themselves to create overlapping fields of fire, turning the valley floor into a death trap. High-powered rifles fired from elevated positions, their bullets ricocheting off rocks and sending deadly fragments in all directions. The distinctive sound of AK-47s created a constant backdrop of terror, while the occasional whoosh of an RPG reminded everyone that the enemy possessed weapons capable of obliterating their fragile cover. Rodriguez pressed herself against a boulder, her medical training automatically cataloging the sounds of battle around her. She could distinguish between different weapon types, estimate distances based on sound patterns, and, most importantly, identify the subtle audio cues that indicated when someone had been hit. It was this last skill that made her blood cold. She was hearing sounds that no medic wants to hear in a firefight. "Medic, we need a medic over here!" The call came from her left, where Corporal Mitchell had taken cover behind an outcropping of rocks. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. Despite the bullets still filling the air, she low-crawled across 30 yards of open ground, her medical pack bouncing against her back as she moved. The journey felt like hours but took less than 2 minutes. When she reached Mitchell's position, she found Private Chen pressed against the rocks, her left shoulder dark with blood. "It's not that bad," Chen insisted, though her face was pale and Rodriguez could see the telltale signs of shock beginning to set in. The entry wound was small, likely from a rifle round, but Rodriguez's experienced hands immediately began assessing for exit wounds and internal damage. Her fingers worked quickly and efficiently, applying pressure to control bleeding while simultaneously preparing the necessary medical supplies. "You're going to be fine," Rodriguez told Chen, though she knew the wound was more serious than either of them wanted to admit. The bullet had passed through the shoulder muscle and likely nicked an artery. Without immediate attention and eventual surgical intervention, Chen could bleed out within hours. But first, they had to survive the next few minutes. The firefight continued to rage around them. Sergeant Torres was returning fire from a position 50 yards to their right, his M4 rifle adding its voice to the deadly conversation echoing through the valley. The distinctive sound of his weapon was reassuring. It meant he was still in the fight. But Rodriguez could hear other sounds that worried her. The labored breathing of soldiers pushing through pain, the slight changes in firing patterns that indicated ammunition was running low, and worst of all, the increasing accuracy of the enemy fire as they adjusted their aim. As she worked on Chen's wound, Rodriguez felt a sharp, burning sensation across her left arm. Looking down, she saw that a bullet had grazed her, tearing through her uniform and leaving a shallow but bleeding furrow in her skin. The wound was superficial, but it served as a brutal reminder that they were all in mortal danger with every passing second. "Rodriguez, we've got multiple casualties!" Torres's voice carried over the gunfire, and Rodriguez felt her heart sink. Multiple casualties meant their situation had just gone from desperate to catastrophic. As the squad's only medic, she would need to prioritize treatments, making the kind of life and death decisions that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She finished stabilizing Chen's wound as best she could under the circumstances, using a combination of pressure dressings and medical tape that would hold until they could reach proper medical facilities. "Stay low and keep pressure on this," she instructed Chen, knowing that the wounded soldier would have to endure pain and fear while Rodriguez attended to others. The movement to the next casualty required crossing another stretch of exposed ground. Rodriguez took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and began her deadly sprint across the killing field. The Taliban fighters had clearly identified her as a priority target. Medics were always. Bullets struck the ground around her feet, sending up sprays of rock and dust that stung her eyes and filled her lungs with grit. It was during this crossing that Rodriguez felt the first bullet pierce her body. The impact felt like being struck by lightning and punched by a heavyweight boxer simultaneously. The bullet caught Rodriguez in her right thigh, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the rocky ground behind a small cluster of boulders. For a moment, the world went silent except for the ringing in her ears. She could see her fellow soldiers firing their weapons, could see muzzle flashes from the enemy positions, could see the smoke and dust of battle, but it all seemed to be happening in slow motion and complete silence. Then reality crashed back with overwhelming force. Pain shot up her leg like liquid fire, and she could feel warm blood soaking through her combat pants. Her medical training kicked in automatically. She was now both the medic and the patient, a role reversal that required her to split her focus between treating herself and continuing to save others. With practiced efficiency, she applied a pressure bandage to her own wound, working around the gear strapped to her legs and the awkward angle of her position. "Rodriguez, you hit?" Torres's voice cut through the chaos, tinged with the kind of concern that veteran soldiers reserve for their most valued team members. Rodriguez tested her weight on the wounded leg. It held, though each step sent waves of agony through her body. She could still move, which meant she could still fight, and more importantly, she could still serve as their medic. "I'm mobile," she called back, though the words came out through gritted teeth. Mobile was a relative term, when every step felt like stepping on broken glass. But in combat medicine, you worked with what you had. She had seen soldiers continue fighting with worse wounds, and she wasn't about to let her squad down now. The casualty that had prompted Torres's call was Private Martinez, their youngest squad member at barely 20 years old. Rodriguez found him sheltered behind a fallen log, conscious but bleeding from multiple wounds. A grenade fragment had torn through his left arm, leaving jagged metal embedded in the muscle, while a rifle round had punched through his right shoulder, missing major arteries by mere millimeters. "Talk to me," Martinez said as she began her assessment, her hands moving with the speed and precision that had made her legendary among the medics. "Tell me what hurts most." "Everything hurts, Doc," Martinez replied, using the nickname the squad had given her. Despite his wounds, he managed a weak smile. "But I can still pull a trigger if you need me to." Rodriguez worked quickly, knowing that every second spent in the open increased their chances of taking more casualties. She cleaned and dressed Martinez's wounds, administered morphine for pain management, and applied the kind of battlefield dressings that would keep him functional until they could reach proper medical facilities. It was rough medicine, practiced under impossible conditions, but it was keeping her soldiers alive. As she worked, Rodriguez became aware of a new development in the firefight. The enemy fire was becoming more concentrated and accurate. The Taliban fighters were adjusting their positions, working to encircle the squad and cut off any possible escape routes. This wasn't just an opportunistic ambush, it was a carefully planned operation designed to eliminate them entirely. "We need to move," Sergeant Torres called out during a brief lull in the firing. "They're trying to flank us on both sides." Rodriguez could see what he meant. Muzzle flashes were appearing from new positions, creating crossfire patterns that would soon make their current defensive position untenable. They would need to fight their way out of the valley, and they would need to do it while carrying wounded soldiers. It was during the attempt to relocate that Rodriguez took her second bullet wound. As she helped Martinez move from his position behind the log to a more defensible location 30 yards away, a sniper's bullet caught her in the left shoulder. The impact spun her around and nearly sent her to her knees, but muscle memory and pure determination kept her upright and moving. This wound was different from the first, deeper and in a more critical location. Rodriguez can feel blood running down her arm and pooling at her elbow, could sense the weakness spreading through her left shoulder as damaged muscles struggled to function. But Martinez was depending on her, and she could hear Chen calling for assistance from her position. There would be time to properly treat her own wounds later, if there was a later. The pain was becoming a constant companion now, a burning presence that colored every movement and every thought. Rodriguez had trained extensively in pain management techniques, both for treating patients and for maintaining functionality when injured. She drew on every lesson she had learned, using breathing techniques to control the immediate agony and mental exercises to maintain focus on the task at hand. "Doc, you're bleeding pretty bad," Martinez observed as they reached their new position. His young face was creased with worry, not for himself, but for the woman who had just risked her life to move him to safety. "I've had worse," Rodriguez lied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The combination of wounds was starting to affect her coordination and stamina. But her soldiers were depending on her, and she had never failed them before. She wasn't about to start now, regardless of how many bullets found their mark.
The Taliban fighters had been planning this ambush for weeks, and their patience was now paying deadly dividends. What had begun as a concentrated attack from elevated positions had evolved into a sophisticated pincer movement designed to eliminate every member of Rodriguez's squad. The enemy had divided into three groups, one maintaining suppressing fire from the ridgeline, another moving to cut off their retreat route, and a third advancing through the rocky terrain to engage them at close quarters. Rodriguez could hear the distinctive sound of boots on stone as enemy fighters worked their way closer to their defensive positions. Her training had taught her to identify threats by sound. The rhythmic scraping of equipment against rock, the whispered communications in Pashto, the metallic clicks of weapons being readied for close combat. They had perhaps 5 minutes before the situation degraded from a firefight into hand-to-hand combat, and Rodriguez knew her wounded soldiers wouldn't survive that kind of encounter. "We need to establish a casualty collection point," she called to Torres, who was coordinating their defensive fire from a position behind a large boulder. The sergeant understood immediately. They needed a central location where Rodriguez could treat the wounded while maintaining some protection from enemy fire. He pointed to a natural depression in the rocky terrain, partially sheltered by an overhang that would provide cover from above. Moving the wounded to the collection point required exposing herself to enemy fire repeatedly. Rodriguez made 3 separate trips across bullet-swept ground, each journey adding new tears to her uniform and new scratches to her exposed skin from rock fragments kicked up by near misses. On her second trip, carrying Private Chen, a bullet passed so close to her head that she felt the shock wave and heard the distinctive snap of supersonic metal passing inches from her skull. It was during her third trip, helping Martinez reach the casualty collection point, that Rodriguez took her third and fourth bullet wounds in rapid succession. The first caught her in the right arm, just below the elbow, the impact sending electric shocks of pain up to her shoulder and down to her fingertips. Before she could fully process this new wound, a second bullet punched through her left side just above her hip bone. The force of the impact sent her stumbling, but military training and sheer stubbornness kept her upright. Rodriguez could feel blood soaking through her uniform in multiple places now, could sense the weakness creeping into her limbs as her body struggled to cope with the trauma. But Martinez was still leaning on her for support, and Chen was calling for medical assistance with a new wound that needed immediate attention. "Doc, you need to let someone else take over," Martinez said, his young voice filled with concern as he watched blood dripping from Rodriguez's fingers. "You're hurt bad." "There is no someone else," Rodriguez replied simply, and they both knew it was true. She was the squad's only medic, and her wounded soldiers were depending on her expertise to keep them alive until they could reach proper medical facilities. Her own wounds would have to wait. The casualty collection point quickly became a scene of controlled chaos. Rodriguez worked with methodical efficiency, despite her injuries, triaging wounds and applying treatments with hands that were increasingly unsteady from blood loss. Chen's shoulder wound had reopened during the movement, requiring fresh dressings and additional pressure to control bleeding. Martinez had developed signs of shock, his skin becoming clammy and pale as his body struggled to cope with trauma. But it was the arrival of Corporal Davis that truly tested Rodriguez's limits as both a medic and a human being. Davis had been manning a forward position when an RPG explosion sent shrapnel tearing through his lower body.
Torres and another soldier carried him to the collection point, and Rodriguez immediately saw that this was the worst casualty she had encountered in her 3 deployments. Davis was conscious, but fading fast. Multiple fragments had penetrated his abdomen, and Rodriguez could see signs of significant internal bleeding. His pulse was thready and rapid, his breathing shallow and labored. Under normal circumstances, Davis would need immediate surgical intervention to survive. Under current circumstances, Rodriguez would have to perform life-saving procedures with basic medical supplies while enemy bullets whistled overhead. "Stay with me, Davis," Rodriguez said as she prepared the most advanced medical treatments her field kit could provide. "I'm going to get you through this." She began working with an intensity born of desperation, using every technique she had learned in military medical school and combat training. Her own wounds protested with each movement, sending waves of pain through her body that threatened to overwhelm her concentration. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As she worked on Davis, Rodriguez felt 2 more bullets find their mark. The 5th wound was a graze across her back that tore through her uniform and left a burning track across her shoulder blades. The 6th was more serious, a bullet that entered her left thigh and lodged against the bone, sending nauseating waves of pain through her entire body. The cumulative effect of her wounds was becoming impossible to ignore. Rodriguez could feel her strength ebbing with each heartbeat, could sense her hands becoming less steady as blood loss began to affect her coordination. But Davis's life hung in the balance, and she had made a promise to never leave a soldier behind. She continued working, drawing on reserves of determination she didn't know she possessed. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate with each passing minute. The Taliban fighters had successfully maneuvered into positions that created a deadly crossfire over the squad's defensive position. Bullets were now coming from 3 different directions, making it virtually impossible to move without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Torres had established communications with their base, but the nearest reinforcements were at least 2 hours away, an eternity in their current situation. Rodriguez had stabilized Davis as best she could under the circumstances, using advanced field medical techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with basic equipment. She had stopped the most serious bleeding, administered morphine for pain management, and applied pressure dressings that might keep him alive long enough to reach proper medical facilities. But she knew that Davis needed surgery within the next few hours, or he would die regardless of her efforts. It was while she was checking on Martinez's condition that the 7th bullet found her. This one caught her in the right side of her back, just below her shoulder blade. The impact felt like being struck by a sledgehammer, and for a moment, Rodriguez's vision went white with pain. She could feel the bullet's path as it tore through muscle and scraped against bone before lodging somewhere deep in her torso. "That's it, Doc," Torres called from his position. "You're done. Let someone else handle the medical stuff." But they both knew there was no one else with her training and experience. The other soldiers were infantry specialists, trained in basic first aid, but lacking the advanced medical knowledge needed to keep critically wounded soldiers alive. Rodriguez tested her range of motion, gritting her teeth against the pain. Her right arm was significantly weakened, and she could feel blood soaking through the back of her uniform. But her hands still worked, her mind was still clear, and her soldiers still needed her. She had been trained to function under extreme duress, and this was exactly the kind of situation that training was designed for. The 8th bullet wound came as Rodriguez was applying fresh dressings to Chen's shoulder. She felt the impact in her left arm just above the wrist, a burning sensation followed by the warm flow of blood down her forearm. This wound was different from the others. She could feel that the bullet had fractured bone, making her left hand significantly less functional. She would now have to perform medical procedures primarily with her right hand, despite the weakening effects of the wound in her back. Chen saw the new wound and grabbed Rodriguez's arm to examine it. "Doc, this is bad," she said, her own pain temporarily forgotten as she saw the extent of her medic's injuries. "You've got bone fragments visible here. You need immediate treatment." "I need to keep you people alive," Rodriguez replied, though she could feel her body beginning to shut down from blood loss and trauma. Her vision was starting to tunnel slightly, and she could feel the cold clamminess that indicated her body was going into shock. But Davis was still critical. Martinez needed constant monitoring, and Chen required regular attention to prevent her shoulder wound from becoming life-threatening. The tactical situation took another turn for the worse when Torres reported that the Taliban fighters were preparing for a final assault. "They're massing for a ground attack," he called over the gunfire. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they overrun our position." Rodriguez understood what this meant. They would need to move, carrying their wounded, while under direct fire from multiple directions. It was during this discussion of their desperate options that Rodriguez took her ninth and final bullet wound. She was crouched beside Davis, checking his pulse and monitoring his breathing, when a sniper's bullet caught her in the right shoulder. The impact sent her sprawling across the rocky ground, her medical supplies scattering around her. This wound was the most serious yet. Rodriguez could feel that the bullet had shattered her collarbone and done significant damage to the surrounding muscle and tissue. Her right arm, already weakened by previous wounds, now hung nearly useless at her side. She was running out of functional limbs, running out of blood, and running out of time. "That's 9, she said to herself, taking inventory of her wounds with the detached professionalism that had sustained her through 3 combat deployments. 9 bullet holes, multiple fractures, significant blood loss, and signs of shock setting in. By every medical standard she knew, she should be dead, or at least completely incapacitated. But her soldiers were still alive, still depending on her, and still fighting against overwhelming odds. Davis needed continuous medical attention to survive the next few hours. Martinez was stable, but required monitoring. Chen could function, but needed someone to manage her pain and watch for complications. They were her responsibility, her family, and she had never failed them before. Torres appeared beside her, his face grim with the knowledge of what their situation had become. "We need to move, Doc. Can you make it?" He could see the extent of her wounds, could see the blood that soaked her uniform in multiple places, could see the way she struggled to maintain consciousness. Rodriguez looked at her wounded soldiers, then at the terrain they would need to cross to reach safety. 6 miles of mountain terrain, carrying wounded soldiers, while being pursued by enemy fighters who knew the ground better than they did. It should have been impossible, especially for someone with 9 bullet wounds and advancing shock. "I can make it," she said, and somehow she meant it. The decision to move was made for them when enemy fighters began advancing through the rocks toward their defensive position. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes getting closer, could hear the shouts of Taliban commanders coordinating their final assault. They had perhaps 5 minutes before their position would be overrun, and 5 minutes to organize a fighting retreat across 6 miles of hostile mountain terrain. Torres quickly organized the squad's remaining effective soldiers into a moving formation designed to protect their wounded. Rodriguez found herself in the center of the group, responsible for maintaining the medical care of 3 critically injured soldiers while dealing with her own 9 bullet wounds. The weight of her medical pack, combined with her injuries and blood loss, made every step a monumental effort of will. The first mile was the most dangerous, as they were still within range of the enemy's prepared positions. Bullets continued to crack overhead as the squad moved in bounds, some soldiers providing covering fire, while others advanced, then switching roles to maintain continuous protection. Rodriguez struggled to keep up, her wounded leg threatening to give out with each step, while her damaged arms made it nearly impossible to maintain her balance on the rough terrain. Davis was unconscious now, carried by 2 soldiers who took turns bearing his weight. Rodriguez monitored his pulse and breathing whenever they paused, adjusting his position to maintain his airway and checking his bandages for signs of renewed bleeding. She knew that his condition was critical. Without surgical intervention within the next few hours, he would die, regardless of their efforts to reach safety. Martinez had developed a fever, a sign that infection was beginning to set in around his shrapnel wounds. Rodriguez administered antibiotics from her dwindling medical supplies, but she knew that field medications could only do so much. His condition would continue to deteriorate until they reached proper medical facilities, assuming they lived that long. Chen was holding up better than the others, her shoulder wound painful but not immediately life-threatening. She had insisted on carrying some of Rodriguez's medical supplies, recognizing that the medic was struggling under the combined weight of her equipment and her injuries. "You've carried us this far, Doc," she said during one of their brief rest stops. "Let us help carry you for a while." The second mile brought new challenges as the terrain became more difficult. They were now climbing steadily, working their way up ancient goat paths that wound precariously along cliff faces. The altitude made breathing more difficult, especially for the wounded soldiers whose bodies were already struggling to cope with trauma and blood loss. Rodriguez found herself gasping for air, her damaged lungs protesting against the thin mountain atmosphere. It was during this climb that Rodriguez first began to understand the true magnitude of what they were attempting. 6 miles might not sound like much under normal circumstances, but carrying wounded soldiers across mountain terrain while being pursued by enemy fighters transformed it into an epic journey that would test every limit of human endurance. Her 9 bullet wounds seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, reminding her that she was operating far beyond what should have been medically possible. The pursuing Taliban fighters had not given up. Rodriguez could hear them behind the squad, working their way up the same paths and probably moving faster than the Americans who were burdened with wounded soldiers. The enemy knew this terrain intimately, knew the shortcuts and the ambush points, and they were highly motivated to prevent any of the American soldiers from escaping to tell their story. By the third mile, Rodriguez was operating on pure willpower and muscle memory. Her medical training had become so ingrained that she could monitor her patients and adjust their treatment even while semi-conscious from blood loss and exhaustion. She moved like a sleepwalker, placing one foot in front of the other while her mind focused on the vital signs and medical needs of her fellow soldiers. Torres had organized the squad into a protective formation around their wounded, with the most effective fighters on the perimeter and the casualties in the center. Rodriguez moved within this protective bubble, checking on Davis's unconscious form, monitoring Martinez's fever, and ensuring that Chen's shoulder wound remained stable. Her own 9 bullet wounds had become a constant source of agony, but she had learned to compartmentalize the pain and focus on her responsibilities. The mountain terrain seemed designed to test their resolve. Loose shale shifted under their boots, threatening to send them tumbling down cliff faces. Sharp rocks tore at their uniforms and equipment. The thin air made every breath precious, while the constant threat of enemy contact kept them in a state of hyper-alert exhaustion that pushed their bodies beyond normal human limits. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Rodriguez realized that her medical supplies were running dangerously low. She had used most of her morphine managing pain for the wounded soldiers, had exhausted her supply of pressure bandages treating their various injuries, and was down to basic first aid supplies that would be inadequate if anyone developed serious complications. But there was no choice except to continue. Behind them lay certain death at the hands of pursuing Taliban fighters. Ahead lay the possibility of rescue, medical treatment, and survival. Rodriguez adjusted her medical pack, checked on her wounded soldiers one more time, and prepared for the most difficult 3 miles of her life.
By the 4th mile, Rodriguez was no longer walking. She was stumbling forward through sheer force of will, her body operating on reserves she didn't know existed. The 9 bullet wounds had created a web of pain that encompassed her entire torso and limbs. Blood loss had progressed to the point where her vision periodically darkened around the edges, and she had to pause frequently to prevent herself from losing consciousness entirely. Davis had taken a turn for the worse. His breathing had become shallow and irregular, and Rodriguez could feel his pulse growing weaker with each check. The internal bleeding that she had managed to slow with field dressings was beginning to overcome her treatments. She knew with clinical certainty that he was dying, but she refused to accept defeat. Using the last of her morphine and the most advanced techniques in her medical arsenal, she worked to stabilize him during their brief rest stops. "Doc, you need to save yourself," Torres said quietly during one of these medical interventions. The sergeant had been watching Rodriguez's condition deteriorate and understood that she was pushing far beyond what any human body could endure. "We can carry the others. You need to focus on staying alive. Rodriguez looked up from her work on Davis, her face pale but her eyes still burning with determination. I don't leave people behind, she said simply. Not while I can still help them. Torres nodded, understanding that he was witnessing something extraordinary, a level of dedication and courage that transcended normal human limitations. The terrain was becoming increasingly treacherous as they climbed higher into the mountains. The path was now little more than a series of rocky ledges connected by steep, crumbling sections that required careful navigation even under ideal conditions. With wounded soldiers and pursuing enemies, each section became a life-or-death challenge that tested their collective will to survive. Martinez's condition had stabilized somewhat, but Rodriguez could see signs that his body was beginning to shut down from trauma and exhaustion. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his responses to her questions were becoming increasingly sluggish. She administered the last of her IV fluids, knowing that this was likely the final medical intervention she could provide with her dwindling supplies. Chen had become Rodriguez's assistant medic by necessity, helping to monitor the other wounded soldiers and providing basic care under Rodriguez's direction. Despite her own shoulder wound, Chen had proven remarkably resilient and had learned to perform simple medical procedures that freed Rodriguez to focus on the most critical cases. It was during the ascent of a particularly steep section that Rodriguez heard the sounds that chilled her blood, the distinctive noise of helicopter rotors echoing off the canyon walls. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Rescue helicopters would mean immediate medical evacuation for her wounded soldiers, professional medical care that could save lives that were hanging by threads. But the sound was coming from the wrong direction. Instead of the familiar rhythm of American helicopters, Rodriguez recognized the distinctive rotor signature of Soviet-era aircraft still used by Taliban allied forces. The enemy had called in air support to prevent their escape, turning their desperate journey into an even more impossible mission. "We need cover," Torres shouted as the helicopter sound grew louder. The squad scattered toward whatever protection the rocky terrain could provide. But Rodriguez knew that their options were limited. They were exposed on a mountainside with wounded soldiers who couldn't move quickly. If the helicopter spotted them, they would be sitting ducks. The aircraft appeared around a bend in the canyon, flying low and fast as it searched for signs of the American soldiers. Rodriguez pressed herself against a rock face, using her body to shield Davis from view while fighting to control her breathing. Her wounded lungs were burning from the exertion, and she could taste blood in her mouth, a sign that one of her internal injuries was more serious than she had initially assessed. The helicopter made 2 passes over their position, its crew scanning the rocky terrain for movement. Rodriguez held her breath, knowing that discovery would mean certain death for all of them. The wounded soldiers couldn't run, couldn't hide effectively, and couldn't fight back against an aerial platform. Their only chance was to remain motionless and pray that the rocky terrain provided enough camouflage. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the helicopter moved on to search other sections of the valley. The squad waited in tense silence until the rotor noise faded completely before attempting to move again. Rodriguez used this forced pause to check on her patients, noting with growing concern that Davis's condition continued to deteriorate despite her best efforts. The 5th mile brought them into terrain that was even more challenging than what they had already traversed. The path now led through a series of narrow defiles carved by centuries of water erosion. These passages provided excellent concealment from aerial observation, but created new dangers in the form of potential rock falls and ambush sites where enemy fighters could wait in perfect concealment. Rodriguez's strength was failing rapidly now. Each step required a conscious act of will. Each breath was a struggle against damaged lungs and blood loss. Her 9 bullet wounds had become a symphony of agony that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness with every movement. But her soldiers were still alive, still depending on her medical expertise, and still fighting their own battles against pain and despair. "Half a mile to go," Torres announced during their next rest stop, though Rodriguez could hear the strain in his voice. The sergeant was pushing himself to his own limits, coordinating their movement while helping to carry Davis and keeping watch for enemy pursuit. Every member of the squad was operating beyond normal human endurance, driven by bonds of loyalty that transcended individual survival instincts. It was during this final phase of their journey that Rodriguez made a discovery that changed everything about their situation. While checking Davis's pulse and monitoring his breathing, she noticed something that made her blood cold, signs of internal bleeding that indicated his condition had progressed beyond what field medicine could address. Without immediate surgical intervention, he would die within the next few hours, regardless of whether they reached safety. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had carried this man for 5 miles, had used most of her medical supplies keeping him alive, had pushed her own body beyond its breaking point to save him. And now, with rescue perhaps within reach, she was faced with the medical reality that her efforts might not be enough. But giving up was not in Rodriguez's vocabulary. She had made a promise to never leave a soldier behind, and she intended to keep that promise even if it cost her everything. Drawing on the last reserves of her strength and medical knowledge, she prepared to attempt the most advanced field surgery of her career. Procedures that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with basic equipment and no support facilities.
With less than a mile remaining to their extraction point, Rodriguez faced the most critical decision of her military career. Davis was dying, his internal injuries overwhelming the field treatments she had been able to provide. She could see the signs of irreversible shock setting in. His skin was cold and clammy, his pulse was becoming thready and irregular, and his breathing was growing increasingly labored. Without immediate intervention, he would not survive the final mile of their journey. The squad had taken shelter in a small cave carved into the mountainside, providing temporary protection from both enemy observation and the harsh mountain weather. Rodriguez spread out her remaining medical supplies, taking inventory of what she had left to work with. It wasn't much. A few surgical implements, some remaining bandages, and basic medications that were insufficient for the kind of life-saving procedures Davis needed. "I'm going to attempt emergency surgery," Rodriguez announced to Torres, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. It's his only chance. The sergeant understood immediately what this meant. Rodriguez would be attempting to perform complex medical procedures while severely wounded herself, using inadequate equipment in a hostile environment. The chances of success were minimal, but the alternative was certain death for Davis. Chen and Martinez, despite their own wounds, positioned themselves to assist however they could. Chen would help maintain Davis's airway and monitor his vital signs, while Martinez would hold surgical implements and provide whatever support his injuries allowed. It was a team effort born of desperation and mutual loyalty, soldiers doing whatever was necessary to save one of their own. Rodriguez's hands were shaking from blood loss and exhaustion as she prepared for the surgery. Her 9 bullet wounds had left her with limited use of both arms, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each heartbeat. But her medical training had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation, performing life-saving procedures under impossible conditions with inadequate resources. The surgery itself was a testament to the power of training, determination, and sheer force of will. Working by the light of a tactical flashlight held by Chen, Rodriguez opened Davis's abdomen and began searching for the source of his internal bleeding. Her movements were precise despite her trembling hands. Her knowledge of human anatomy guided her through procedures that would have challenged experienced surgeons in fully equipped operating rooms. She found the problem. A piece of shrapnel had nicked a major blood vessel, causing slow but steady internal bleeding that was gradually killing Davis. The fragment was lodged in a position that made removal extremely dangerous, but leaving it in place would result in continued bleeding and certain death. Rodriguez made the decision to attempt removal, knowing that she had one chance to save her soldier's life. The procedure required her to work with one hand while using the other to control bleeding, a nearly impossible task given her own injuries and the primitive conditions. Chen assisted by providing suction and holding tissue out of the way, while Martinez kept Davis's head positioned to maintain his breathing. It was surgery performed by wounded soldiers in a cave, with enemy fighters possibly pursuing them and rescue still miles away. Somehow, Rodriguez succeeded. She managed to remove the shrapnel and repair the damaged blood vessel using techniques she had learned in advanced combat medicine courses. The bleeding stopped, Davis's pulse began to strengthen, and his breathing became more regular. It was a medical miracle performed under conditions that should have made success impossible.
But the surgery had cost Rodriguez dearly. The physical exertion had reopened several of her own wounds, and she could feel fresh blood soaking through her uniform. Her strength was now completely exhausted, and she was operating on nothing but willpower and the knowledge that her soldiers were depending on her. "Can you make the last mile?" Torres asked, though he could see the answer written on Rodriguez's face. She was beyond the point where normal human endurance could carry her further. 9 bullet wounds, severe blood loss, and the exhaustion of performing emergency surgery had pushed her past every conceivable limit. "I'll make it," Rodriguez replied, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to quit now. Davis was alive because of her efforts. Martinez and Chen were stable and functional, and rescue was less than a mile away. She would find the strength to complete their mission, regardless of what it cost her. The final preparations for movement took on a different character now. Rodriguez could no longer carry her full medical pack, so the essential supplies were redistributed among the other soldiers. She could barely walk unassisted, so Chen positioned herself to provide support while still managing her own shoulder injury. The squad formed a protective formation around their medic, understanding that she had given everything to keep them alive. As they prepared to leave the shelter of the cave, Rodriguez took one last look at her soldiers. Davis was unconscious but stable, his vital signs stronger than they had been in hours. Martinez was alert and functional despite his wounds, ready to contribute to their final push towards safety. Chen was determined and capable, having proven herself as both a soldier and an assistant medic under the most trying circumstances. Torres coordinated their movement with the careful precision of a veteran leader who understood that they were asking the impossible of already exhausted soldiers. "One more mile," he said quietly. "We've come this far together. We finish this together." Rodriguez nodded, drew upon reserves of strength she didn't know existed, and took the first step of what would be the longest mile of her life.
The last mile stretched before them like an eternity carved in stone and suffering. Rodriguez's world had narrowed to the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other, each step a monumental achievement of will over flesh. Her 9 bullet wounds had transformed her body into a map of agony, but her mind remained focused on the single imperative that had driven her for the past 6 miles: keep her soldiers alive until they reached safety. The terrain for this final stretch was perhaps the most treacherous they had encountered. The path wound along a narrow ridge with steep drops on both sides, requiring careful navigation even under ideal conditions. With wounded soldiers and Rodriguez barely able to remain upright, each section became a test of collective determination and mutual support. Davis remained unconscious, carried between 2 soldiers who had volunteered for this burden despite their own exhaustion. Rodriguez monitored his condition during their frequent rest stops, checking his pulse, listening to his breathing, and adjusting his position to prevent complications. The emergency surgery she had performed in the cave had stabilized him for now, but she knew that he needed professional medical care within hours to survive. Chen had become Rodriguez's constant companion and support, helping the wounded medic maintain her balance while continuing to assist with basic medical care for the other casualties. Despite her own shoulder wound, Chen had proven remarkably resilient and had developed an intuitive understanding of what Rodriguez needed before she asked for it. "How are you holding up, Doc?" Chen asked during one of their brief pauses, though she could see the answer in Rodriguez's pale face and labored breathing. The medic was operating on pure determination now, her body having exhausted every reserve of strength and endurance. "I'm still here," Rodriguez replied, which was about all she could manage. Speaking required energy she could barely spare, and she was conserving every ounce of strength for the task of walking. Her vision was becoming increasingly unreliable, with periods of darkness that forced her to rely on Chen's guidance to navigate the rocky terrain. The sounds of pursuit had grown fainter as they climbed higher into the mountains, but Rodriguez knew that the Taliban fighters hadn't given up. The enemy understood the strategic value of preventing any American soldiers from escaping to report on the ambush. They would continue hunting until the squad reached the safety of their extraction point, or until all of them were dead. Martinez had developed new complications, his fever was spiking, and Rodriguez could see signs of infection spreading from his shrapnel wounds. She administered her last antibiotic injection, knowing that this was the final medical intervention she could provide until they reached proper facilities. His condition would continue to deteriorate without professional treatment, adding urgency to their already desperate race against time. The emotional weight of their situation was becoming as challenging as the physical demands. Rodriguez could see the exhaustion and pain in her soldiers' faces, could hear the strain in their voices, could sense the growing desperation that came with pushing human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. But she could also see something else, an unbreakable determination to complete their mission and an absolute refusal to abandon their wounded comrades. It was during a particularly difficult section of the trail that Rodriguez experienced what she would later describe as an out-of-body moment. Her physical form continued moving forward, guided by Chen and driven by muscle memory and training, but her consciousness seemed to float above the scene, watching a mortally wounded medic somehow continuing to function despite injuries that should have killed her hours ago. From this detached perspective, she could see the full magnitude of what they were accomplishing. 9 bullet holes should have ended her journey before it began. Blood loss should have rendered her unconscious miles ago. Exhaustion should have overwhelmed her will to continue. Yet somehow, through a combination of medical training, military discipline, and sheer stubborn determination, she was still moving forward, still caring for her soldiers, still refusing to accept defeat. The extraction point was a helicopter landing zone carved into a flat section of the mountainside, chosen for its accessibility and defensive advantages. As they approached the final quarter mile, Rodriguez could see aircraft in the distance, the distinctive silhouettes of rescue helicopters that represented salvation for her wounded soldiers. But the sight of rescue brought a new challenge. Rodriguez realized that she had been operating on adrenaline and willpower for so long that the prospect of finally reaching safety threatened to overwhelm her remaining reserves. Her body was ready to collapse, held upright only by the knowledge that her soldiers still needed her. "Almost there, Doc," Torres called from his position at the front of their formation. "Medical evac is waiting." Rodriguez could hear the emotion in his voice, relief, exhaustion, and pride in what they had accomplished together. They had carried their wounded across 6 miles of hostile mountain terrain while being pursued by enemy fighters. They had refused to leave anyone behind, had refused to accept defeat, and had refused to let their wounded die. As they approached the landing zone, Rodriguez could see medical personnel preparing to receive casualties, professional medics with proper equipment and training who would take over the care of her wounded soldiers. The knowledge that Davis, Martinez, and Chen would receive the treatment they needed allowed Rodriguez to finally acknowledge what her body had been telling her for miles. She was at the absolute end of her endurance. But they were going to make it. All of them. Together.
The helicopter landing zone appeared through the mountain haze like a vision of salvation. Rodriguez could see the medical team waiting with stretchers and advanced equipment, their presence representing the culmination of the most extraordinary journey of her military career. 6 miles of hostile terrain, 9 bullet wounds, emergency surgery performed in a cave, and the weight of keeping 3 critically wounded soldiers alive. All of it had led to this moment. But as they approached the final 100 yards, Rodriguez faced her greatest challenge yet. Her body, having operated on pure willpower and adrenaline for hours, was beginning to shut down now that safety was within reach. Her legs were threatening to give out completely, her vision was tunneling to narrow pinpricks of clarity, and she could taste blood with every labored breath. Chen sensed Rodriguez's condition and tightened her grip on the medic's arm. "Stay with us, Doc," she said urgently. "We're almost there. Don't quit on us now." But Rodriguez could feel consciousness slipping away, her body finally succumbing to the massive trauma it had endured. 9 bullet holes, severe blood loss, and the physical demands of carrying wounded soldiers across mountain terrain had pushed her far beyond human limits. The medical team rushed forward to meet them, professional medics who immediately began triage procedures on the approaching casualties.
Rodriguez watched through fading vision as they took charge of Davis, their practiced hands checking vital signs and preparing him for immediate evacuation. The emergency surgery she had performed in the cave had worked. Davis was alive and would receive the professional care needed to complete his recovery. "We need a stretcher over here," one of the medical team members called out as he assessed Rodriguez's condition. He could see the multiple bullet wounds, the blood-soaked uniform, and the signs of severe shock that indicated a casualty in critical condition. Rodriguez tried to protest, to insist that she could walk to the helicopter under her own power, but no words came out. Torres appeared beside her as the medical team prepared to transfer her to a stretcher. "You did it, Doc," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought them all home." Rodriguez managed a weak smile, understanding that this veteran sergeant's approval meant more than any medal or commendation ever could. She had kept her promise. No soldier left behind. The helicopter evacuation was a blur of professional medical care and high-tech equipment. Rodriguez drifted in and out of consciousness as the medical team worked to stabilize her condition during the flight to the forward operating base. She could hear fragments of medical terminology, multiple GSWs, severe blood loss, possible internal bleeding, but the words seemed to be coming from very far away. During her moments of clarity, Rodriguez could see her soldiers receiving treatment in the aircraft around her. Davis was connected to multiple monitors and IV lines, his condition stabilized but still critical. Martinez was alert and responsive, his fever beginning to break as antibiotics flowed into his system. Chen was sitting upright despite her shoulder wound, refusing sedation so she could monitor the others and provide whatever assistance the medical team needed. The forward operating base medical facility was a marvel of modern battlefield medicine, a fully equipped trauma center capable of performing complex surgeries and providing intensive care in a combat environment. Rodriguez was rushed into surgery immediately, where a team of experienced military surgeons worked to repair the damage from her 9 bullet wounds. The surgical team faced an extraordinary challenge. Rodriguez had sustained injuries that individually would have been serious, but collectively should have been fatal. Bullets had damaged multiple organ systems, fractured bones, and caused internal bleeding that had somehow been controlled through sheer force of will and basic field medicine. The fact that she had remained functional for 6 miles of mountain terrain while caring for other wounded soldiers defied medical explanation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead surgeon, had seen thousands of combat casualties during her deployments, but Rodriguez's case was unique. "I've never seen anything like this," she told her team during the operation. "The determination required to function with these injuries goes beyond anything in medical literature. This soldier redefined what's possible." The surgery took over 8 hours, with specialists working to repair damage to multiple organ systems while carefully removing bullet fragments and reconstructing damaged tissue. Rodriguez's survival was far from certain. She had lost enormous amounts of blood, her body was in severe shock, and several of her wounds had caused complications that threatened major organ function. But Rodriguez had one advantage that couldn't be measured in medical terms: the knowledge that her soldiers were alive because of her efforts. During the darkest moments of her recovery, when her body fought to heal from wounds that should have been fatal, this knowledge provided strength that went beyond physical healing. Davis survived and made a full recovery, returning to active duty with a deep respect for the medic who had saved his life through emergency surgery performed under impossible conditions. Martinez recovered completely from his wounds and went on to become a combat medic himself, inspired by Rodriguez's example of dedication and courage. Chen requested transfer to Rodriguez's unit and became one of the most respected soldiers in their battalion. Torres recommended Rodriguez for the Medal of Honor, writing in his report, "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez displayed courage and dedication beyond anything I have witnessed in 20 years of military service. Her actions saved the lives of 3 soldiers and demonstrated the highest ideals of military medicine and soldier care." The story of the 6-mile carry would become legend in military medical circles, studied as an example of what's possible when training, determination, and an unbreakable commitment to fellow soldiers combine under the most extreme circumstances.
Rodriguez's recovery was a testament to the same determination that had carried her through that impossible 6-mile journey. For weeks, she drifted between consciousness and medically induced comas as her body fought to heal from wounds that had pushed her beyond every conceivable limit. The medical team at the advanced treatment facility worked around the clock, performing multiple surgeries to repair damage from her 9 bullet wounds and address complications that arose during her recovery. The story of her heroic carry began to spread through military channels even before she regained full consciousness. Combat medics from across the theater of operations requested copies of her medical reports, studying her techniques and trying to understand how she had managed to perform life-saving procedures while sustaining injuries that should have been immediately incapacitating. Her emergency surgery on Davis, performed in a cave with minimal equipment, became a case study taught in advanced combat medicine courses. Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had led Rodriguez's surgical team, found herself fielding calls from medical professionals around the world who wanted to understand the physiological mechanisms that had allowed Rodriguez to function at such an extraordinary level. From a purely medical standpoint, what she accomplished should have been impossible, Dr. Martinez explained to a gathering of military medical professionals. She redefined our understanding of human limits under extreme stress. When Rodriguez finally regained full consciousness 3 weeks after her evacuation, her first words were questions about her soldiers. "How are Davis, Martinez, and Chen?" she asked, her voice weak but determined. The nurse smiled and informed her that all 3 had made full recoveries and had been asking about their medic every day since their own treatment had concluded. The reunion between Rodriguez and her soldiers was an emotional moment that highlighted the bonds forged in combat. Davis, now fully recovered from his internal injuries, credited Rodriguez with saving his life through her battlefield surgery. "Doc performed a miracle in that cave. She saved my life while she was dying herself. I owe her everything." Martinez had not only recovered completely, but had requested assignment to medical training, inspired by Rodriguez's example, to become a combat medic himself. "I want to be able to do for others what Doc did for us. She showed me what it really means to be a soldier, never leaving anyone behind no matter what it costs." Chen had become one of the most vocal advocates for Rodriguez's recognition, speaking to anyone who would listen about the extraordinary courage and medical skill she had witnessed during their 6-mile journey. "People need to understand what she did. 9 bullet holes, and she still carried us home. She still saved our lives. That's not just heroism, that's something beyond heroism." The military medical community began studying Rodriguez's case not just for its immediate lessons about trauma care, but for its broader implications about human performance under extreme stress. Researchers wanted to understand the psychological and physiological factors that had allowed Rodriguez to transcend normal human limitations. Sports medicine specialists examined her case for insights into peak performance, while military psychologists studied her mental preparation and decision-making processes. Rodriguez herself was uncomfortable with the attention her story was receiving. During her recovery, she repeatedly insisted that she had simply done her job, that any combat medic would have done the same thing under similar circumstances. "I'm not a hero," she told the stream of visitors who came to interview her. "I'm a soldier who refused to leave her people behind. That's what we're trained to do." But her fellow soldiers and the medical professionals who treated her knew otherwise. They understood that what Rodriguez had accomplished went far beyond training or duty. It represented a level of commitment and courage that redefined what was possible when human determination was pushed to its absolute limits. The awards and recognition began even before Rodriguez was medically cleared to return to duty. The Medal of Honor recommendation submitted by Torres was fast-tracked through military channels, with each reviewing authority adding their own comments about the extraordinary nature of her actions. Combat medical organizations presented her with their highest honors, while medical schools requested permission to use her case as a teaching example. Rodriguez's story also had profound effects on military medical training programs. The techniques she had used to perform emergency surgery under primitive conditions were incorporated into advanced combat medic curricula. Her approach to triage and patient care, while personally wounded, became required study for military medical personnel. Most importantly, her unwavering commitment to never leaving a soldier behind became a defining example of military medical ethics. The psychological impact of her story extended beyond the medical community. Soldiers throughout the theater of operations drew inspiration from Rodriguez's example, understanding that their medics would go to any lengths to keep them alive.
This knowledge provided a level of confidence and morale that contributed to mission effectiveness across multiple units. When Rodriguez finally was cleared to return to active duty, she faced a choice that would define the remainder of her military career. She could accept assignment to prestigious medical facilities in safe rear areas, where her expertise would be valued and her safety assured, or she could return to forward combat units, where soldiers continued to face the same dangers that had led to her own extraordinary ordeal. Rodriguez chose to return to the field, explaining her decision in characteristically simple terms. "This is where soldiers need medics the most. This is where I belong." Her choice surprised no one who knew her, but it reinforced the understanding that her actions during that 6-mile carry had not been an aberration. They had been the natural expression of a commitment to service that defined everything about who she was as a soldier and as a human being.
Years later, the story of Rodriguez's 6-mile carry continues to resonate throughout military and medical communities worldwide. What began as one soldier's refusal to abandon her wounded comrades has evolved into a defining example of human potential when confronted with impossible circumstances. The lessons learned from her experience have influenced everything from combat medical training to civilian emergency response protocols. The Medical University of the Uniformed Services established the Rodriguez Center for Combat Medical Excellence, where her techniques and decision-making processes are studied by the next generation of military medical professionals. The center's motto, "Beyond Limits, Beyond Self," captures the essence of what Rodriguez demonstrated during those crucial hours in the Afghan mountains. Rodriguez herself continued serving in combat zones for another 6 years after her recovery, participating in multiple deployments where her expertise and reputation preceded her. Soldiers specifically requested assignment to units where Rodriguez served, knowing that they would have the finest combat medic in the military watching over them. Her presence alone boosted morale and mission confidence in ways that couldn't be quantified, but were immediately apparent to everyone involved. The impact of her story extended far beyond military circles. Medical schools began teaching the Rodriguez protocols, emergency procedures developed from her battlefield innovations that could be applied in civilian trauma situations. Emergency room physicians studied her triage methods, while paramedics learned from her approach to providing care while personally injured or under extreme stress. The psychological aspects of her achievement became subjects of intense study as well. Researchers wanted to understand how Rodriguez had maintained focus and functionality while experiencing pain and trauma that should have been overwhelming. Her case contributed to new understandings of human resilience and the power of mission-focused thinking to transcend physical limitations. Davis, Martinez, and Chen each went on to distinguished military careers, with all three crediting Rodriguez's example as the defining influence on their approach to service and leadership. Davis became a physician's assistant specializing in trauma care. Martinez completed medical training and served as a combat medic in subsequent deployments, and Chen rose through the ranks to become a senior non-commissioned officer known for her unwavering commitment to soldier welfare. Torres, the sergeant who had witnessed Rodriguez's extraordinary performance firsthand, became one of the most sought-after instructors in the military's leadership development programs. His presentations about the 6-mile carry were legendary among military audiences, not just for their dramatic content, but for their insights into the kind of leadership and commitment that emerges under extreme pressure. The Medal of Honor ceremony, held at the White House 18 months after the events in Afghanistan, was attended by military medical personnel from around the world. When Rodriguez received the nation's highest military decoration, she used her brief remarks to honor all combat medics who had made similar sacrifices in less publicized circumstances. "This medal represents every medic who has risked everything to save a fellow soldier," she said during the ceremony. "It represents the commitment we all make to never leave anyone behind, regardless of the cost. I accept this honor on behalf of every man and woman who has chosen to serve others before themselves."
The story of the 6 Mile Carry has been documented in military histories, medical journals, and biographical works that continue to inspire new generations of service members and medical professionals. But perhaps its most important impact has been on the soldiers who serve, knowing that people like Rodriguez are willing to sacrifice everything to bring them home safely. Rodriguez eventually retired from active duty and became an instructor at the Army Medical School, where she trained combat medics who would deploy to conflicts around the world. Her students learned not just medical techniques, but the ethical framework that had driven her to transcend human limitations when her soldiers' lives depended on her actions. In her teaching, Rodriguez emphasized that heroism wasn't about extraordinary physical capabilities or exceptional circumstances. It was about making the choice to serve others regardless of personal cost. Anyone can be a hero, she told her students. It's not about being stronger or braver than others. It's about refusing to quit when people are counting on you. The lessons of the 6 Mile Carry continue to influence military medicine and emergency response procedures decades after the events in Afghanistan. Rodriguez's techniques for performing medical procedures while wounded are taught to first responders worldwide. Her approach to triage under extreme conditions has been incorporated into disaster response protocols. Most importantly, her example of absolute commitment to saving lives has become a standard that inspires medical professionals in both military and civilian settings. Rodriguez's story ultimately transcends the specific circumstances of that October day in Afghanistan. It represents the potential that exists within all of us when we commit ourselves completely to serving others. 9 bullet holes, 6 miles of hostile terrain, and the weight of saving lives while dying herself. Rodriguez proved that human determination can overcome any obstacle when motivated by love for fellow human beings. The legacy of the impossible carry lives on in every soldier who refuses to abandon a wounded comrade, every medic who risks everything to save a life, and every person who chooses to serve others before themselves. Rodriguez showed us that there are no limits to what we can accomplish when we commit ourselves completely to something greater than our own survival. Her story reminds us that heroes aren't born. They're forged in moments when ordinary people make extraordinary choices. And sometimes those choices change not just individual lives, but our understanding of what it means to be human. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.